Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the Fayetteville Public Library. My name is Joel Bunch. I'm a reference librarian, and I just want to say a big thank you to the KUAF R Word podcast, as well as the Zacchaeus Foundation. Yes, give them a round of applause. We've been partnering with them for a little while on bringing these events. Hope to continue doing that. So today we have Dr. Christina Edmondson, author of Faithful Anti-Racism. Dr. Edmondson is going to be talking about their book. They'll also be doing a curated conversation, and then the Q&A, and then there'll be a book signing following that. Pearls is on hand, and the back there, Daniel has copies for sale. And then we also have a box in the back if you'd like to tell us what you thought about today's event. There are feedback forms in your chairs. We'd love to hear your comments, your ideas for the future. We read each and every one of those. And also, there is a book display in the back of books from the library's collection that are all available for checkout on related themes to today's topic. So feel free to check those out. There's also a Pathfinder with more resources. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Edmondson.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much for that efficient introduction. So we can get into it. And I was just over there joking with my husband. We don't usually get to take trips together, and so we cut up so bad, y'all. I promise we will behave appropriately today. But we were just joking about how there are some churches, some traditions, where when people introduce their spouse, it's usually a male clergy person who is trying to get in good graces of their wife. And they use all these terms like, you're the sugar in my coffee, you're the chocolate in my hot chocolate. And I was like, I'm gonna start introducing you like that as my smoking hot husband. And then he leaned over and said, just call me Smokey. And so this is my beloved husband, Smokey, Reverend Dr. Micah Edmondson, his real name. Anyway, but thank you all so much for having us here. And I decided to use this time. They gave me about 30 minutes, so I'm going to attempt to talk to you a little bit about this book that I wrote along with my colleague and friend, Chad Brennan. And hopefully this presentation will include some elements that are not in the book so that it will inspire you to get the book. If you haven't gotten it, you'll get more information, okay? So we're going to talk a little about what it means to pursue faithful anti-racism. Y'all ready to go? Yes. Let's go. All right, so here's a text. This comes from the New Testament scriptures within the context of the Christian faith. It reads from Colossians 2:8, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. Hollow, empty, not substantive. Deceptive, giving an appearance or impression different from the true one, misleading, sneaky, y'all. Philosophies, the systematized study of a general or fundamental questions about something. Human tradition, nostalgic, mythologies, traditions. Elemental spiritual forces, conjured forces. See to it that you don't get taken captive by such things. It seems to me that humans have a tendency to get taken captive ideologically by deceptive things. Now, at the time that this letter was communicated, most commentaries don't really tell us what that thing specifically was for this group of people, but I imagine that you and I could do an exercise today and say, what could that thing be in our world right now? What might be an example of a hollow, deceptive philosophy? One that depends on human tradition. One that certainly has spiritual and evil forces behind it. Well, there's one that I can think of very quickly, and it's called white supremacy. Now, there are many others, too. We could probably go on for a while. But We're reminded in this text, and maybe in this short presentation today, the importance of seeing to it. That means being in a defensive posture, taking it seriously, not being so high-minded that you are above deception. Because I must tell you, the easiest person to trick is one who thinks they can't be. So what is faithful anti-racism? Why did we title this book this way, knowing that it would make people upset? And let me tell you, it has made people upset. Listen, I do not get up in the morning with the goal of making the people mad. I really don't. I really do like to live on mind your business street, okay? But I felt like, yeah, well, let's just name it what we're talking about, on the nose. And so it is called faithful in two ways. In two ways it is faithful, or we attempt to be faithful. Full of faith. We are talking about anti-racism from our particular religious tradition, which is the Christian faith. Chad and I, as we wrote this book. But also faithful has to do with kind of a disposition and integrity, a kind of a character, the way that you operate in this world. And so we were attempting to be, one, filled with faith as people of faith, but also to have great integrity as we pursue anti-racism, because character matters. And anti-racism, what does this mean? So I am grateful for the work of Ibram Kendi and other contemporary historians, for example. But the word anti-racism certainly predates the last 10 or even 20 years. I would propose to you that the word goes all the way back to race in and of itself. And that there always have been people, since the categorization and stratifying of human beings has been put out for the purpose of profit, who have said, not on my watch, who have been anti-racist. And certainly there have been generations of abolitionists of various forms who would have also worn that hat. So when we're talking about anti-racism, we're talking about an old term, a term that goes all the way back to the manufacturing of racialization for the purpose of profit. And as long as there's been one person who said it's not right, we've had anti-racists in the room. But I'm in the South, and I'm in Arkansas. This is mainly going to focus on Georgia and Tennessee, which is great. But the reason why I think Chad and I thought it was important to write this book is because we are educators. I was raised by an educator. Shout out to my mom, Baltimore City Public Schools. And while I don't think that education changes human hearts, I really don't. I think a heart that is being changed will seek to know better and to do better. But I also know that education and propaganda are incredibly powerful. It has shaped our imaginations, and by us, I mean those of us in the context of the U.S., from the South to the North to the East to the West. And I want to show you an example of that before we get into what I hope are some of the highlights and some additional information from the book. You ready? All right.
Listen to how this textbook describes slavery. The master often had a barbecue or a picnic for his slaves. Then they had a great frolic. Even while working in the cotton fields, they sang songs. The beat of the music and the richness of their voices made work seem light.
Yikes, that's from History of Georgia, a textbook published in 1954 that was taught across junior high schools in Georgia for decades. That sort of language is part of an intellectual movement called the Lost Cause, a distorted version of American Civil War history that's been prevalent in the South for a long time. It took shape soon after the defeat of the Confederate States in the war, when Southern historians like Edward Pollard and former Confederate General Jubal Early started preserving the South's perspective through their writings. They framed the Confederate cause as a heroic defense of the Southern way of life against the overwhelming forces in the North. That narrative has a few basic tenets: the glorification of Confederate soldiers who died for a cause they believed in, the belief that slavery was a benevolent institution, and maybe most importantly, that
1900 was there's a new generation of white Southerners being born and they never experienced the war years.
That push is visible. Most of the Confederate monuments were erected during the UBC's height of influence.
There's a rhetoric around monuments that we want to get this thing built before all of that generation has died off, and the reason we want it is to teach future generations about those men.
Dr. Karen House wrote the book on UBC, and I asked her if it was fair to say the group established the lost cause as a historical fact in the South.
Oh my God, yeah. They were the leaders of the lost cause into the 20th century, and they made a movement about vindication.
Just to give you an idea of how effective they were, they successfully lobbied for a Confederate memorial in Arlington National Center, which U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proudly unveiled to the cheering crowd. Now that's influence, right?
Monuments are the least of what they did. I mean, they're the most visible and tangible, but the work of children was far more influential.
It turns out the central UBC objective was shaping how children think about the war and their civic heritage. One of their most powerful tools, textbooks. Think of this pamphlet called A Memory Line for Textbooks. It was written by the illustrious Southern historian Miss Mildred Rutherford, an educator, orator, and author of Southern history textbooks. She also was very quick-witted. The pamphlet announced the formation of a textbook review committee featuring prominent Southerners like 5 former Confederate generals. This group was committed to spreading the truth of Confederate history, so they instructed school boards to reject any textbooks that did not accord full justice to the South. And they urged writers to replace every book in the collection that didn't measure up by writing the words unjust to the South clearly on its cover. This pamphlet was shared widely with school boards throughout the South, and UBC-backed committees closely monitored history books to make sure Northern influence never reached the classrooms. So the core language of a approved textbook aligned precisely with that of the lost cause. You know, stuff like Confederacy laws were between the states, but Georgia never forgot the honor of Confederate soldiers. History of Georgia was on the UBC's approved list. It was also written by E. Mervyn Coulter, a self-described Southern historian, and his historian described white supremacists.
They understand that how you educate, who wins the writing game, who wins the battle over history, ultimately wins the war. That's the big fight for the UBC.
But their work with children went further than the classrooms. The UBC formed an auxiliary group called the Children Confederacy, which was designed to get kids born in former Confederate states to actively participate in their version of history. Group leaders had kids recite call and response truths from something called the Confederate Catechism. Children up to the age of 18 would compete and be rewarded for memorizing long passages of the lost cause rhetoric.
So it would be like an after-school thing. You know, if you go to your club, you can go after school to the meeting of the Children of the Confederacy, and your leader might teach you songs from the South, like Dixie or other songs that were considered Southern patriotic songs. They would have them write essays, they would visit the veterans, and learn this catechism.
Children were also the centerpiece of their community's monument buildings, like this living flag at the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. Yes, for the school children. UBC's efforts shaped the opinions of children who grew up with the lost cause. They made history personal, and that made the story last longer.
Generations and generations of children learning that narrative in a variety of ways grow up to be in segregations in the 50s and 60s. But that's been drilled into the system.
Well, for a long time. Education is just powerful. And while I don't necessarily think it changes a human heart, it can shape generations for sure. One of the things that power affords you is the ability to write curriculum, to prioritize what is to be learned and what is not to be learned. There is a reason why smart people, although they may not be wise, recognize that books are incredibly powerful. And that if you can control or burn or get rid of books that tell a story that you don't feel comfortable with, then you can shape the imagination of a generation. I've heard that's happening now in some places. Psychologists use a concept called strategic ignorance. And I don't know about you, but there are some things in my life and in this world that I'm like, I just don't want to know and just wish it wasn't true. But imagine if I had social power and I could combine not wanting to know something along with social power. and I could shape curriculum and policies and practices and doctrine and Christian traditions to accommodate my priorities. I could even develop propagandized curricula. And when we allow ourselves to not be properly educated, we re-traumatize people who are the descendants and the people who carry the burden of such history. There's a built-in gaslighting, a conditioned apathy and cruelty when we shape people to deny, to minimize, and to denounce the realities of history. And so I always tell teachers you should teach with a known agenda, because everybody's got one. You should probably say what yours is. And when I was in the classroom for several years in an academic higher ed space, I would tell my students I absolutely have an agenda. It is that you leave this class more just, kinder, wiser. That is absolutely my agenda, not delusion. And that discomfort is necessary for maturation. From the words of my old trainer, boy, do I need her now. She would yell at me across the room, if it don't challenge you, it won't change you. Get those knees up higher. So let's get challenged. And I'm grateful for women like Charlamagne Hill Rollins as we sit here in a library, a radical librarian. Isn't it cool that librarians can be radical? The power of books, you know? And one of the things that she emphasized to counteract what we just learned about, the ways in which textbooks were shaped by the Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, that one particular group, is that she set out a whole new way of thinking about how we select books for children of color, specifically Black children in the city of Chicago. Think about what she prioritized in comparison to what you just heard in the previous video. The standards for selecting books about Negroes for young people are the same as those for selecting any book. It should have literary merit and interests because of lively moving action or interests in the people and backgrounds. The characters should have the reality of life. You should ask yourself the following questions when you are selecting books that depict Black children, is what she's saying. Are the people portrayed in the book natural or real? Are they presented from a distorted point of view? Does the book set up standards of superiority or feelings of inferiority in the minds of the children who read it? Is the book free from derisive names and epithets that would offend? These seem like very reasonable standards for this radical librarian to pursue. And you can see why her work and the work of other librarians is critically important to counteract the long-standing propaganda that we have in this country that we may not even realize that we have in this country. So why write a book about race in general called Faithful Anti-Racism, and what in the world is race to begin with? It's a real question, but I'd like for you to let it marinate a bit. What is it? You know, sometimes people play like semantic language games so that we actually do not reach any solutions together. Have you seen that happen? Like everybody just gets real deep, or they get the opposite of deep, like real clueless. Like, well, what does that mean? Whatever could that be, right? And when we do that sometimes, it's so that we actually don't come to the table and begin to tell the truth and to problem solve and to do the best we can with what we have. So I'm going to offer to you today one perspective about what race is. You may have others, but I'm going to give you mine because they gave me the mic. When you get yourself a mic, you can give yours. So I am talking to you today about race as a concept that is on the agenda of oppression and stratification. Not simply anthropological categorizing of a people group ethnically, but designed to create a system in which there is a demarcation of identity for the justification of who gets to own and who gets to be sold, and who gets to live in the middle and vie for whatever crumbs fall from the table. So race in this sense is about categorization for the purpose of stratification. So not just understanding our differences, because we do have differences. Cultures have differences and similarities, but for the purpose of stratification, for the purpose of social hierarchy, so that a system of injustice can be maintained. And we can look to the works of people like Charles Darwin, but many, many others across a whole host of disciplines, including my own psychology, who helped to concretize these pseudosciences about this concept of race. Maybe you've heard the beginning of the title, The Origin of Species. We remember that from school. By means of natural selection. We remember that part. Preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Maybe not the third line so much. So racial stratification, it takes work. It has to be maintained. People will tell you that it's like natural, like the way it's supposed to be. That's one of those myths. The illusion of normalcy or inevitability, like this is kind of how people live, it's just this is how it's going to be. Every continent has its way of doing this. And yes, there is injustice from people group to people group, but let me tell you something. The United States created a heck of a racialized system. So immoral, yet impressive. So immoral, yet impressive, that Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa both said, let's see what they're doing so we can try that over here. That's terrible. Terribly impressive. Exceptionally wicked. And so, this illusion of normalcy, we've got to push back on that. And the other things that maintain racial stratification, well, you've seen this. And depending on where you're from and what generation you're a part of, maybe you've seen it more than others. But the reality is that racial stratification demands violence. It demands blood sacrifices. And if it doesn't have violence on the nose, it has certainly the threat of violence. There are people who are African American who live in different parts of the United States right now precisely because of the threat of violence. The Great Migration is a response to, a reaction to the threat of violence and real violence. My family moved from Mississippi to Maryland for that reason. The other way that racial stratification is cemented, the way that it persists, the way it continues to be propped up is through political powers and laws. Now, we've had a long history of political powers and laws that right on the nose would say, hey, you can come, you can't come. You can go here, you can't go here. But over time, oh, how crass. The language has shifted and changed so that racialization language has become cultural language or nuanced language that doesn't quite say it on the nose but still produces the same effects of social stratification and segregation today. And then here's the big one, and this is why our book is called Faithful Anti-Racism. Number 3, y'all. What does it take to help us keep racial stratification? Religious and moral complicity. So human beings have this thing called a conscience, or they're supposed to. I mean, seriously, we've never quite measured it, but it's a thing we're supposed to have. Separates us from other animals. This conscience. And I don't know about you, I would imagine for most people the feeling or the viewing of someone being lynched would be disturbing. Traumatizing even. It would require a powerful psychological response to continue life as usual, business as usual, in the face of the hundreds of years of racialized oppression in the United States. It would require a way to still feel like a good person even while others suffer. And religion can be used to do that very thing. Religion can be used to tell us what we should care about and how much we should care about it. Religion can be used to tell us how we should advocate or if we shouldn't advocate at all, because that is not holy. That is not the business of the church. Religious and moral complicity are an essential component to upholding racial stratification. At least that's what we propose. Which is why we believe that people of faith, and in the context of the United States, specifically Christians and white Christians on the nose, have a particular burden because they have a particular legacy and they still retain a particular power that could be used to be complicit or to do something about racial injustice. You tracking with me? Now, remember, I just described something that is super traumatizing. It's painful. It's awful, right? And it shapes all of us. It shapes the people who are in positions of power, and certainly it shapes and injures the people who are harmed by racism. That means we have a whole party, a whole cookout of traumatized people in the United States of America. Now, of course, I see it this way. I'm a psychologist with a trauma background, so we see trauma everywhere, y'all. But I feel like I could make a decent case for this, that we are a traumatized people. And the way in which racial trauma for people of color, but even for people who are in the racially dominant group, works out, I would propose to you is the way that everything works out when a stimuli frightens us, when it threatens us. Our nervous system kicks into gear, deciding I need to preserve your life. And we go into these fight, flight, freeze, and fawn modes. And maybe this will resonate with you when it comes to racial injustice. Maybe you're a person who is a fighter. Mr. Bear comes into the room, you're on guard. You're ready to fight the bear. Maybe you get out of here. Maybe out that window. Flight. Maybe you completely freeze in place. You don't know what to do. You don't know what to say. You don't want to look stupid. Heaven forbid, you may look even racist. Maybe you fawn. You appease. You negotiate with bigotry. I mean, I can't defeat it. How can I coax it? How can I go along with it? I don't want to upset it. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn to this traumatic reality of racism. So I'm going to scoot us ahead because I want to make sure we have a good time for our conversation in the panel. So why don't we do something about it? Why don't we do something about it? Why don't we do something about racism? Well, one of the reasons why we don't do things about it, the people who have power to do something about it, is because it's costly. It will actually cost something. It's because it's painful. Because throughout history, people who actually have done something about it, they pay a price for it. And so we count the cost. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Can you get it done? Do you have the fortitude? Do you have the strategy? Do you have the community? Were you just sad and angry when you saw that footage of that officer with his knee on that man's neck for 8 minutes? But like most of the nation, 6 months later, you said, I'm tired of talking about this black stuff. Counting the costs. And here are the real costs: isolation, in-group abandonment. This is what happens when people tell the truth about racism. It's a downer, y'all, but I think it's good to know. Isolation and in-group abandonment, specifically for white people. When they say the obvious, racism is real and it is wrong and we should stop it, you should anticipate isolation and in-group abandonment. You should also anticipate potentially violence and harassment. Not because I want this to be the reality, because history has shown that it is the reality. You may even feel your own sense of despair and doubt. Is this worth it? This is painful. I could just look away. And then here's the big one. And Americans, we really don't like this typically. There's no guarantees. And what I mean by that is we cannot with 100% confidence say our efforts are going to work out in this way, in this moment, at this time. Love is always a risk. Love is always a risk. Love always requires courage. So isolation, potential harassment, doubt and despair, and there's no guarantees. So then why would someone lean in to be a faithful anti-racist? Dare I say it's because it's the right thing to do. And some things you do because it is who you are. If you're a faithful anti-racist, it's because it's who you are. It is who you are. This is what you're going to do. You're going to write down this text, whether you have a Bible or not. You have something called Google. This will be your homework. If you haven't been to church or you don't go to church, welcome to churchy people stuff, okay? I'll give you a disclaimer. Some wild church people out here, it is true. This is true. I may be one of them. But if you look at this, you can look at it purely from a sociological standpoint, I promise, okay? Acts 16, 16 through 30, this is your homework. I want you to look it up. And when you read it, I want you to read it through the lens of this conversation today. Read it through the lens of oppression. Read it through the lens of religious people who really don't want to break the chains of those who are in bondage. Read it through the lens of what it means to say something is wrong in a system where an entire economic ecosystem is built on injustice and everyone is in on it. Read that scripture with that particular hermeneutic, that particular lens. And if you find me on the internet, tell me what you thought about it, okay? You got it? So I'm going to skip ahead, but I want to press pause because I want to make sure we have time for a conversation. These are all things you'll find in the book. How do you fix racism? The things that are magical thinking that actually don't work, like the younger generation is going to help us. Y'all, they're racist too. They're racist and they can use technology, okay? I'm just telling you. I mean, matter of fact, maybe I'll show you that one. You might get a kick out of that one. You know, there was once a person named George Washington, you might be familiar with him, who said when he was asked to join an anti-slavery petition, you know, Washington owned many a people, in 1785, he responded, "It would be dangerous to make a frontal attack on a prejudice which is beginning to decrease." In other words, it's just a matter of time. This is about to go away. Slavery's not going to be a thing tomorrow. It's all good. That was in 1785, y'all. Slavery would not be abolished for another 80 years. The younger generation will not save us. They're embarrassed by us right now. I'm going to end with someone whose words are better than mine, who I just got to hear from a few days ago. But hopefully it will motivate you. 1, to buy the book. 2, to do your home assignment, right? And 3, to know that being a faithful anti-racist is about doing what you can with what you have in this present moment. Faithful, not perfection, faithful.
We have this exhibit in our museum. We have these jars of soil that we put on shelves, and they're from lynching sites. And we had a lady got to go to one of the sites, and she was nervous when she got there because it was a remote location on a dirt road. And she was out of the site. She got on her knees. She was going to start reading a pickup truck through a big white guy truck. Stares at her, slows down, turns around, drives by again, stares
And so my last words to you before we go to the panel and we hear from incredibly smart people is why don't we get our hands dirty? Why don't we get our hands? You won't be alone. Let's get our hands dirty together. Thank you.
Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. You've filled this room and provided Dr. Edmondson with a very warm welcome, and we're so proud of Fayetteville for doing that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Trisha Posey from John Brown University, and a historian. And so I'm so grateful, Dr. Edmondson, for the ways that you highlighted the importance of history. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you.
And I am Caree Banton. I'm the chair of the history department at the University of Arkansas. And, as historians, yes, we're, having to grapple with history. We know that you're in Tennessee and you're probably fighting a bigger battle than us.
Bum, bum, bum.
But we're grateful to have you here today and to have our community here today to have this much needed discussion and for us to wrestle with this very difficult topic together.
So I'm so grateful for your book. So grateful for your book.
Thank you.
Which I led a book group at JBU on this, and the conversations that we had were so rich and meaningful. And so all of you in the room, you need to read this book. And what struck me about it was, you have a background in sociology, in psychology, in trauma therapy, in cultural intelligence. And I saw all of those things come together in this book. Can you talk a little bit about how all of those things wove themselves together as you were working on the book?
So one of the points that we try to make about chapter 1 is about faithful anti-racists are wise. There's a spoiler for you. And one of the things that I think one of the practical applications of wisdom is being able to use what you have, your various backgrounds, your life experiences, your disciplines, and to, in some ways, submit them over so that they could be used for good. And so I happen to have a background in social sciences, undergraduate degree in sociology, emphasis in race, class, and gender, another degree in family systems, and another one in psychology, so counseling psych, and have spent a number of years in higher education studying and learning about what does it mean to learn, and what does it mean to learn things that you don't want to learn, right? And so when I teach about race, I know I'm often teaching about a topic people do not actually want to know about because it's painful. It's very similar to when I'm working with, in some instances historically in my previous work, if I'm working with a family where there's been a child who has been terribly abused. And they can love this child, but they don't want to know. Because when I tell them what has happened to this child, they are going to have to reckon with that. Their lives are going to have to be changed. The fantasy they were operating under is going to be destroyed. So does it mean for us to learn something that is true? And we know we should learn it, but we really don't want to learn it. So what I'm trying to do is bring to bear all of those disciplines into this book, as well as my colleague, Chad Brennan, who is a researcher, quantitative and qualitative. And so we try to, again, offer the best that we had. And that's what I think about this book is we know so many wonderful writers and colleagues who have contributed for generations. Beautiful prose, just wonderful, compelling research. And we just wanted to add to that conversation the best that we could add. And I would extend to you all, you have something to add, whatever that might be. I'll end it with this. I had a student who I was working with who was a part of a cohort for first-generation college students, and a part of the work that we did was help them to think in a adjusted-minded way about whatever they were studying. And this is a student who was studying highway engineering and the development of roads. And he was like, well, Dr. Edmondson, how can that relate to justice? I was like, oh my goodness.
Oh, dear.
That is a great question, right? And that's a question he asked his first semester, his freshman year. And postgraduate school now, right? He can tell you how he can pursue the shaping and the designing of cities in ways that are just, that knit people together, that counteract food deserts, that help people who are locked out of the job market be able to have access to transportation to get into the job market, that there is a just way to think about how we design roads. And so I say that to any and everyone in this room, that whatever you do, whatever your experiences have been, there is a way for you to put that, or to infuse that with the intention of being and doing justice. And it'll be better than what you think it will be. Just give it a go.
Amazing. So I guess the other bit that needs to, be woven in there is the Christian dimension, right? And that, speaking to that particular audience, and while reading the book, I kept thinking about, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. And, in your explanation just now, when you were speaking about the ways in which, that kind of cognitive dissonance, how that plays out for Christians, right? And the ways in which you explain how racism tries to re-erect the walls of hostility that Christ paid the price for. Can you talk a little bit about that, right? By adding that kind of Christian religious dimension.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about something that is structural.
Yes.
Right? That we think about as historians, as political scientists, as sociologists. And we're adding that religious dimension to it to wrestle with this idea. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So disclaimer to people who are not of the Christian faith, it's about to get real preachy right now. Just roll with us, y'all. So first I'll start by saying this, is that religion is highly political. Whether you are a person of faith or not, you know that religious people who have social power have a lot to say about your life. So Christianity is a very political religion, very political. And so I think being able to say it, be able to name it matters. Christians believe, at least throughout history, I mean, I know we got all kinds of flavors, but for the most part, we believe that we serve a king. That is a political title. That is a ruler. That is a leader. Now, this king is different than the kings that we think of in this world. A king who might hoard spoils and who might colonize and who might dominate. We serve a king who, instead of taking our lives, gave his life. That's a very different kind of king. We serve a leader, a ruler who knows injustice intimately, knows what it means to have nailed above his head, King of the Jews, not in a positive way, but in a slur-like way. That was an insult that was given to him. He knew what it meant to be oppressed by the Roman majority, the political power of his day. He knew what minority status, political status felt like. He knew what it meant to be a day laborer. So when you think about the historic African-American church singing songs like "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," nobody knows, that's what they're talking about. That this is a Jesus who empathizes with people because it is a kingship that came down as a servant. So it's political, but it's a very different kind of political than what we're used to. It's a righteous political power. And Christians are political people. The ones who act like, I could care less about that stuff. I'm so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. Or those who are like, if we don't get the right people on the Supreme Court, everything's going to explode and the world's going to fall apart, right? And then you have others who said, no, we're going to march and we're going to pursue nonviolence like the way we saw our Lord do. And we are going to push and push and push in righteous ways until laws change that not only benefit African American people, but benefit every immigrant group and women in this country because of that spiritual and religious conviction. So I would say all the Christians are real political. Don't let them fool you. It's about the ways in which they believe that politics is supposed to show up and who it's supposed to be on the agenda of serving and loving and blessing. So that was a really long disclaimer. What was your question again? Say it again. But I just wanted to say that because some of y'all may not be like, what is that with them Christians? And I wanted to give you some context.
I was asking you, you're kind of suggesting that racism is a kind of principality.
Yes, it's evil. Yes, it's very evil.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think you have to be a Christian to buy that, though. You can be of any faith, or a person who is a humanist or not a faith at all, who's like, yeah, there's a thing called evil. Like you can just watch the news, or go to a family reunion. Like that things are not the way they should be. Okay, and I think from a social science background, I think I can hold those things together. The sense that there are principalities, there are things that I cannot see, and yet they are manifesting in laws, in policies, in practices, and behaviors. And if you're a person who can only see or believe in one of those things, right? So if you're a person who's like, well, I see it in the system, like the systemically broken, that's fine, that's cool. I think for Christians, because it is a faithful anti-racism book, we're saying to them that our weapons are not carnal. We have some spiritual weapons, spiritual resources that we are called to use that give us the courage and empowerment to be able to persist and to give ourselves up for a cause. And that requires more than sociology or psychology to do. There needs to be a type of otherworldly courage, love, and empowerment, like the kind of love that makes a mom run back into a burning building to get her child.
Yeah.
Love makes you do things like that. And racism in this country is a burning building that is dangerous and has killed many a people, right? But love will compel you to do that. And so yes, racism is a principality, and we need a particular type of spiritual empowerment for Christians who want to be anti-racist in order for us to go the distance, for us to stay the course, and for us to operate in integrity and not compromise.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I want to follow up on that because the foreword to the book was written by Michael Emerson, who wrote a book in the 1990s, Divided by Faith, that really demonstrated that white Christians and African American Christians really saw the world through two very different lenses, and really in part because of their different understandings of Christianity.
Indeed.
And in the book, it seems pretty clear that those divisions still exist. Yeah. So can you talk about that a bit? And what do we do? What do we do about that real division? Because there's just such different visions of what's going on here.
Yeah. So Michael would say that, and as recent as the last maybe 2 years, and I think of him as a very warm and very kind, non-intentionally provocative type of guy. But I have heard him give talks as of late where he's just kind of like, well, 25-40% of these white Christians, they're not Christians, y'all. Right? Now, that's what Michael said. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. The Lord will sort it out. Okay. But I think what he's saying is, and he's saying that based on their responses to questions that list things that people, when Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant historically would have said were core teachings, where they're like, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. But that's Supreme Court. I know about that. So he's saying that based on what he's seeing in the data. So early in the book, there is a story. Chad is a white man. Let me give you context. Chad is a white man. And we both tell stories about kind of our background. And I share a story about basically being discipled in a historic black church and meeting Black Jesus. And he tells a story without saying the word, but basically meeting white Jesus. And the ways in which we were both shaped because of these different Jesuses that we met. And I talk about what it was like to grow up in a church where, you know, there was a mural probably as big as the height of that wall right there, of a dark-skinned, thick, woolly, hair like mine, curly hair, Jesus on a cross. And flags from many, many nations all around the church. There was not like one singular American flag. That would have been super weird. I think that is a thing. I know that's a thing in many churches, but that would have been weird in the church that I grew up in. There were many, many flags. To say that Jesus loves the world, not just America. And there was an ethic that was articulated within that Black church context. My pastor, unbeknownst to me as a child, had grown up in Alabama, had been in some ways discipled by Martin Luther King Jr. Didn't know any of this as a kid. I thought everybody's church had this going on, by the way. I realize now that's not the case from the data. But all that to say is that it was assumed, but this is also the same church that would go to the Billy Graham revival. Because we're like, people need the Lord. People need Jesus, right? So super evangelistic, like on the nose, like in the way that like my progressive friends would hate, you know? But very much like, do you know the Lord and the pardon of your sins? Like that kind of, you know. But also like, we're going to vote. And we're going to protest. And we're going to push back on, and name systems of injustice. And so I thought that was happening everywhere. And I realized, of course, it's not, right? In many ways, Chad was having an experience that focused heavily on personal piety around particular body-related dynamics, right? And there were a very select set of political topics that expressed piety, political piety, within his white evangelical church context. And you can probably guess what they were. Things related to sexuality, related to abortion, right? Sometimes it even came out in economic ways too. Like what can you do for poor people without enabling them, you know? So it came out in that way as well. Whereas that was just a very different, so we realized even in our conversations that reflected what we see in the research, the history, and the data is that yes, these are two different worlds. The Black church, the historic Black church, my husband speaks about this really well, is an embodied confessional statement against white supremacy in America. So if you think about a creed or a confession, you can think of the Black church as a living confessional statement against racism in America. Black people are people, is what they teach. That they are loved by God, right? That they have gifts given by the Spirit that they should present, right? And all of that stands against kind of white supremacist teaching that was coming out of the white evangelical church in order to allow for racial stratification in America. So there had to be so much ugliness and wickedness and distortion and corruption of doctrine and development of false doctrine in order to help people to feel a sense of piety while upholding a system of racial stratification. So I think it is fair to say that that infused through American evangelicalism are strands of a false religion. I think that's fair to say. And I think the data would show it. I think the history would show it. That there's something that is there's something that is perverse and distorted. That does not mean that even in the midst of that, there are not authentic expressions within it.
It's quite interesting that you say that. I'm teaching a class called Black Freedom in the Age of Emancipation right now, and my area of expertise is abolition and colonization, and I often, teach about John Newton and, Amazing Grace and how that came about, and, being a slave, working on a slave ship, and you can hear it in the words, I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see, but, say what? No. Okay, but you could there's a scholar who talks about the cognitive dissonance that kind of uphold those kinds of things, and you kind of maybe put a little remix on it, and you call it magical thinking. Yes. You know what I mean? That kind of uphold these kinds of things, and you were alluding to it just now, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about this kind of a magical thinking, and what do you mean by it, and the issues that it presents, especially for Christians?
So our brains really do seek to have clarity. And the way that humans, I think another one of our distinctions that we're storytellers and that we're people of stories. Like, our identities are a compilation of stories that make up who we are, right? Stories that are about my life, but like my grandmother's life and somebody else's life, right? So we're just we are a library. Look at that. And sometimes our stories are true, and sometimes they straight up lies, okay? And our brain is seeking to, one, be at peace and not triggered. And that's where that kind of, when cognitive dissonance comes into play, where there are these two opposing realities, or there's a lie and there is a reality that we have to reckon with, but we don't want to. Our brain is agitating us to deal with it. One might say maybe it's the conscience as well, right? And we can either lean into truth, which is painful, like working out, like my old trainer would tell me to do, or we can feed lies or distraction or dissociation in order to get out of that feeling and that tension. And this is not just about race. This is all kinds of matters in our lives, right? You think about something right now, right? So in all kinds of ways we wrestle with this, right? And so we talk about it as magical thinking, kind of this fictive narrative that we create in our minds in order to be able to endure that cognitive dissonance, that pressure, that tension that's taking place for us. And we do this in many, many ways. You can think about someone who's in a relationship that's like probably not the best relationship for them to be in. And they're managing that cognitive dissonance by saying things like, it's just a matter of time, they're going to change. They're going to change. And then they lean into every little sign that's not really a sign of the person doing the right thing. They're like, see right there? There really wasn't nothing, but see right there, right? And so we start to find ourselves attracted to and collecting data that informs, right, what we want to be true. And the truth is, we're all inclined to believe what we want to be true already. We're most inclined to believe what we already want to be true, right? And so we seek that out, right? And so if we know that the truth is, for example, that there were major denominations that not only were complicit in enslavement, but owned slaves, right? Had people as a part of their asset inventory. If we know that to be true, what does it mean when we're trying to manage the tension of that? If we're a person of faith, we're like, okay, what does it mean about my religion? What does it mean about my grandmother? What does it mean about my Sunday school teacher? What does it mean, So stuff starts to fall apart, and it's okay for it to fall apart. There's a place for that to land and to be discussed and to be sorted through as well. But that is why our brains are eager to do that, so it can find some type of peace. And we'll use lies to have a sense of peace.
That magical thinking chapter was the most challenging chapter for me, and in part because I want to read some of the magical approaches that you list in there. Yeah. The magic of being woke, the magic of an open-minded younger generation, which you mentioned, the magic of racial diversity training programs, the magic of diversity superheroes.
I know. Those poor people. Pay them well, by the way. Pay them well. Much vacation time.
And I have to say, I read those, and at first I was like, wait a minute. But there is so much truth to that. So even folks who might be progressive leaning, right?
Sure.
They can engage in magical thinking too.
For sure.
Can you talk about that some more for us, please, and kind of give us a worded challenge there? Because I think a lot of people in this room would probably fall.
They seem to be at least able to tolerate this conversation.
Yeah.
They look warm and friendly right now. I think. You know what street I'm about to walk down. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a problem with feeling like justice has an ending point or awareness has an ending point. Humility says, which ought to be a Christian principle, by the way, but humility says that I'm in a process of maturation. And the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. The more I know, I'm like, oh man, I didn't used to know that. What else don't I know, right? That I think should be the response. I do think that because of, in some ways, the way the Western brain works, the way that Americans and I'm one of them, the way that Americans think about things, we tend to be pretty compartmentalized. Like, I got that. Next. I got this. Next. And issues of injustice, it don't work like that. You don't have it. These things are complicated. They're painful. We have to take stock of how we are complicit, how we contribute, how we benefit. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there are times when, and I'll just name it specifically, where there may be progressive whites who, their way of not reckoning with how they themselves may benefit from injustice is to point the finger at the other whites. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I get that. I can see why that would be a thing to do. But as we calling people out, we have to make sure we are calling ourselves in too, right? And so there's some of that rebuke that always goes to us, right? It's always easier to see a speck, this is real Christian, the speck in someone else's eye than the plank in our own. And then the last thing I will say is this, there's a story in the New Testament. Get ready for something real Christian. There's a story in the New Testament where a man is born blind, and he encounters Jesus, and Jesus heals him. He touches his eyes. There's dirt, all the things. It's very dramatic scene, y'all. And when he can see again, he does not see perfectly. He does not see clearly. For those who know it, you know that the scripture says that people look like trees. Jesus looks like trees. His neighbors look like trees. He does not see people or God rightly when he is first healed. Doesn't mean he hasn't been touched by God. Newton was on that boat for a while, converted, and still on that boat. So the language that Christians would use was sanctification, that we continue to need to be sanctified, corrected, and rebuked. I believe in church discipline, especially about racism, so that our eyes can continue to be touched, so that we can then see people from trees into their full humanity, from things to beings, and we can even see God more clearly and rightly. And so that, I think, is an example of the beauty of sanctification, but also the humility of sanctification, that we're not one touch and done. We are in a journey. We're in a constant journey because we are growing into something very beautiful, but it's painful along the way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, you spoke a little bit earlier about racism and its inability to persist apart from moral endorsement, right? And, as Liam Neeson says, he has a particular set of skills. And you suggest that Christians have a particular set of skills, right? That the church possesses a particular set of skills. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? About the skills that the church has that might fight racism effectively.
Yeah. That would be a great sermon illustration. I like that narrative. Put that in.
A black preacher gonna preach on that on Sunday.
Put that. It could be me tomorrow. So yes, we have a particular set of gifts, commands, and callings. So I do not think Christians are the smartest people in the room. Or anything in the room. I mean, Christians are people who really need Jesus. That's the Christian distinctive, and that they know it. Like that's the distinction. People who really need the Lord to help them. Okay, Christians who present any other way are missing something. We all miss things. But those special skills don't necessarily come out of our own goodness, but they have been given to us. And I would say some of those are Jesus as our great high priest who's interceding for us now. So one of the ways that Christians refer to themselves as we're part of this priesthood of all believers. And to be a priest in this context is not to be like, I run the show and tell you what to do. To be a priest in this context is that my job is to intercede for my neighbor. It is to bring to God what I see in the world that is hurting, broken, or suffering. That's what a priest does. So the prophet is saying, hey, this is what God is saying to us about what we need to do. The priest is saying, I'm going to say back to God, something's not right with the school systems where we are. So that is one of our jobs, is to be priests. So we should be constantly in communication. So it's prayer. And I know that may not seem like super powerful, but it is. One, I think it's powerful because God is working through it. I don't know how, but God is. But the other reason why I think it's powerful is because it keeps us humble. And there is no growth apart from our humility. The other, I guess, special skill is that we have God's word, in the sense that we have an ethical roadmap of engagement with others. There's some things for us that ought be deal breakers in how we pursue justice. Dehumanizing our enemy, it's a deal breaker. It's a deal breaker. Colluding with unethical and cruel entities just in order to get a win, gotta have some deal breakers on that, you know? Sometimes the righteous thing to do is to lose. I mean, we literally, and the reason why I'm saying is not because I like to lose. I really don't like to lose. But God does something with with our losses. And it's just not all talk, because God did something with God's loss on our behalf. Right? So the center point of the faith is about a redeemed loss. Like that is the cornerstone, the bedrock of the Christian faith, is that there was a loss on behalf of those, right, who Christ took on their sins, and what looked like a loss became full and complete, glorious redemption. God did that. So I think as we get real close to the gospel, it allows us to not be so desperate for earthly wins that we compromise ourselves, our witness, and we lie on the character of our God. That is a skill, in a sense, right? I think we also have a cloud of witnesses, and we have the Catholicity of the church. So that's the last one I will say. And so the book does center on American Christianity. I have a colleague in South Africa who has a South Africa sort of version, his own version of this book that is coming out. But we know there are no Christians at large. We're not in a bubble. America is just a blip in the redemptive history. I don't say that. I don't mean that like in a rude way, but it's Jesus never walked over here. So never spoke English. I mean, we just have to be really humble, and yet we are able to learn. Christians are able to learn from other believers all over the world now, but also throughout history. So I am able to learn from the Desert Mothers. I am able to learn from the underground churches of the world. I am able to learn from the indigenous church in the United States. I'm able to learn from their wisdom. I'm able to learn from Harriet Tubman, not just as an abolitionist or suffragist. I'm able to learn from her as a theologian of practice, as a mother of the American church. I'm able to draw from her wisdom and her strength. And I think I would say that is one of the more disheartening parts when we talk about fighting racism together as believers, as Christians, is that we have the resources of people of various traditions And sometimes I believe our racism is still very much, for our white brothers and sisters, still very much in operation in terms of who they're willing to hear from. And so we have to continue to hear from the riches from the church in the U.S., but throughout history and all around the world, right? And that is a benefit to us. When we come to the communion table, some more churchy stuff. When we come to the communion table, we are not just at that table, in my mind, at this time in 2024. I am joined by a cloud of witnesses together across abilities and disabilities, across experiences, traumas and healings, across languages, you name it. We are together sharing a meal that Christ has given to us. And we need each other, just like at that table, we need each other in order to dismantle these types of systemic sins.
How are we on time?
Oh,
Q&A time now? Okay.
okay.
All right.
All right.
Who has a question they'd like to ask any of these three folks? Raise your hand. Gwen? Is that a stretch or a hand raise? Okay. Come on.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion. My question connects with the two Jesuses. I want to say I'm Jewish, and that's kind of a nice thing because we never paid any attention to, there was nothing after the Old Testament. So everything that I read as far as Jesus, I'm reading with very fresh eyes. So I read Howard Thurman's book on Jesus and the Dispossessed, and it made a lot of sense to me because everything I would read in the gospel, it seemed that Jesus was sympathetic to the dispossessed. And then for a class I'm taking, I'm reading American Idolatry about Christian nationalism. And I can't find a Jesus in there. I mean, even a white one, it's kind of like reading to my nephew, you know, where's Waldo? So is there a white Jesus in the nationalists? And also connected with that, how do I engage in conversation with the white nationalists, white Christian nationalists, if I don't even see Christianity in it without dehumanizing them? Thank you.
Wow, you got a good library. You got some good books. Y'all want to start?
I can tell you she's the most enthusiastic in my class.
Hey, is that one of your students? No. Extra credit.
Yes. I think you should go first.
Okay, they want me to go first. Yeah, so the concept of white Jesus, I'll just play around with that one a little bit, okay? So there is no whiteness in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament in the sense of a racial category, right? But the idea that there is a group who has cultural power, cultural domination that all others are compared to or below, well, that kind of stratification, that's been around since the beginning of time, right? So that concept is there. And when we think about white Jesus and how it relates to Christian nationalism, we're thinking about a narrative, a fictive controlling image, white Jesus, not to be confused with Jesus of Nazareth, white Jesus, who is on the agenda, who works, who puppeteers, who promotes Christian nationalism. Now, with that being said, even one of the most famous images that have been exported around the world is Swedish Jesus, who is, you know, white Jesus' cousin, okay? That came out of, the Evangelical Covenant Church, which is Swedish in its roots. It's one of the most mass-produced images, and this is the Jesus who's got blue eyes. He's got that wavy body wave hair, right? And he's everywhere. One of my good friends who is a Nigerian American, he is inside her grandmother's wallet. we know that's not what Jesus looked like. Okay, we know that's not what the people of that time looked like, right? But it is a powerful, powerful image, and that is the face of the white Christian nationalist movement. And what's the purpose of that? The purpose of the movement is to co-opt an expression of Christianity in order to retain and to acquire political power. So purpose is power, which is very different than like historic, I think, biblical Christianity, which is like laying down power for the good of others, right? So it's exactly just the opposite. But if you feel like you have to help God, you know, if you feel like these Supreme Court justices have to help God, you know, or if that's really not even what it is, if it's just like, I just want my power. You know, you think about the story of the Exodus, and you think about Pharaoh saying like, these people are growing in number. I'm getting nervous. How about let's have them make bricks without straw? Not let me repent and let them go, but let me make them suffer more and control them more, because my goodness, what if I'm projecting my heart onto them? And what if they're like me? And what if they rise up and get justice for what I have done to them? And I would say that Pharaoh mindset is also in the mindset of this kind of distorted white Jesus Christian nationalism as well. I hope that helped. Yeah.
It's quite fascinating, you know, because just thinking about what's going on right now in the Middle East and all of that, and thinking about the social construction of race. And I was looking at something the other day, and a person from the Middle East was, you know, talking about, you know, relatives who had been classified as white, and like, how can I be white? I have olive skin. Well, it was the dominant power group in this country, white, was like, well, Jesus is from that area, so if we don't confer whiteness over there, then that means this, you know, powerful figure then, you know, might not, you know, we might not see him through those eyes, or, you know, of whiteness, if we don't, you know, restructure the narrative and restructure how we racialize certain groups in order to reflect that. So it's quite fascinating. And, you know, speaking of Christian nationalism, I was, you know, thank you for showing that video about the history of Georgia earlier, because, you know, the whole idea of a Confederate catechism was extremely fascinating, right? And can tell, you know, point to some early antecedents to what we're calling Christian nationalism now. Yeah.
And on that point of the Confederate Catechism, my husband actually brought a book home to me one day. He said, you have to see this. And it was that Confederate Catechism. But it was a republication of the text that was published in the 1990s. 1990s.
Sure, there's homeschool curriculum that's actually more modern than that, for sure.
Yeah. But on the topic of white Christian nationalism, I want us to be mindful of the violence that has been associated with this historically. And this really came home to me a couple of years ago. Our campus, some of the faculty members and staff, we went over to the Greenwood Rising Museum in Tulsa, where the Tulsa Race Massacre happened. And while we were there, we visited a historically black church where African Americans in Tulsa took shelter during this massacre. Hundreds killed, and it was a period of intense racial violence. And we went into the basement of this church where members of that congregation had hid in fear while this violence was happening. And I imagined in my mind the white perpetrators of the violence outside the church, just circling while these men and women and children were hiding. And I realized in that moment, those white perpetrators of violence identified as Christians. And wow, the power of white Christian nationalism to lead to violence like that. We can't forget that history, I think, yeah.
I think your response to that is, it's lamentful. It's painful. I was thinking about I think it's Dr. Olivia Hooker, who was the first black woman to get a PhD in psychology at the University of Rochester. I went there for one of my graduate school programs. She was a child during that massacre. And she has since passed away, but she tells a story about intruders coming in, rioters coming into their home, and they, had a cherished piano for devotions and all these things, and there was such a resentment and anger that they had. Who you people have a piano? Yeah. And sitting on top of the piano was a Bible, and before the men began to break the piano apart, they said, "Oh no, stop!" They lifted up the Bible, and they put it aside, and then they destroyed her parents' home. And I think of that as a metaphor of this kind of magical religion that doesn't actually convert a heart, but that would cause you to be superstitious. Like, let me remove this Bible. But the people made in the image of God, I will traumatize this child, and I will destroy her things, and I will go on to kill other people in this community. It's fascinating, and I am a believer who believes that the Bible is inspired. I'm old school traditional Christian in that sense, and yet to think about the fact that to miss that the young girl is made in the image of God, that is sitting right there.
Other questions? Yeah.
Can you just be really practical with us and tell us some steps we can take?
Keep asking the question.
As people who care, and this is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe a step to take to intentionally call out or dismantle racist practices somewhere. Okay. You want to name a place? Oh. In your grandpa's house. Oh, Grandpa. It makes me sad. I'm sorry. That's the pain point, because y'all, this is not my family. I got a black family, y'all. They got issues too, but they're not quite like this. I recognize that when we're talking about white Christian nationalism, we're talking about people's grandparents, talking people's mothers, people's husbands that they are currently with. So it's family business. It's deeply painful. So one thing I would say is that there are some ways in which, and I don't want to overstate this, but nobody's here on social media, I'll just say it like this, okay? That there is a very real propagandizing indoctrination process into white Christian nationalism. And some of us, some psychologists, we think of it as akin to being indoctrinated into kind of any hate group. And there are many people who have studied what does it take to pull people out of an ideology of harm. Like, there's an actual process to do that. The one thing I will say is this, and since you mentioned Grandpa specifically, right, is that people sound like the communities where they think they belong. So belonging drives gang membership, and I would say white Christian nationalism might be a gang, but but I know that's controversial, but I'm gonna say it. But it drives identity and connection around that space too. And when I think about recently, like the ex-evangelical movement, which was largely like white people who were embarrassed by their parents, because their parents were cutting up, and it was more than that, but I think that was some of it too. And I get why people were like, okay, I just can't deal with this anymore. But what that did was, from a de-indoctrinizing standpoint, is that it broke the relationship piece. And relationships have more power than textbooks in helping to shape and reshape people's belief systems. So I would say, and I don't mean this like in some kind of hokey way, I would say love your grandfather. And have a type of belonging towards him that sees his humanity deeply, and pray for the opportunity to point him to be able to see the humanity deeply in others with proper boundaries for your mental health as a psychologist, with proper boundaries. I mean, you know. So I do tell people, I'm like, look, I'm probably not gonna meet your granddad or whoever's granddad, but and I probably shouldn't, right? Depending on what their issues are. But that may be your particular place in which to serve, in which to love sacrificially, in which to not lie, right? Not to stand in agreement with, which is wrong, but you can offer belonging and community to people, because white Christian nationalists think that they're in a community, a real generative community. They really do. That has their back, that has their identity, that has their future, that has their power, that has all the things. And it will disappoint. It's rooted in a lie. It's not sustained by love. There's no beauty and glory in that. It will turn. White supremacy hates white people. You better believe it. And so, so I would encourage you, to extend belonging and truth. If you're in an organization and you're thinking, okay, what can I do tomorrow? The first thing I tell people to do is to learn about where you are, is to become knowledgeable about if you're in church, your tradition, your denomination. Become a deep learner about the history of the place that you are in. And similar to what we saw happen, certainly not perfect, but if I think about South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they started with knowing the offenses. I'm a restorative justice practitioner. Naming and knowing the offenses that racism has done and has cost others, and thinking about practical ways to dismantle those things step by step within your capacity, whatever that is for you. For some people, it is powerful enough just to stand in agreement with reality. Right now, we have an onslaught of lies. I mean, we've got people like, don't read this textbook, burn this. Like, this didn't really happen. Like, slavery was good for the black people. I mean, like, what we saw in that video is still happening. So one step that you can do is to not live in agreement with lies. is to at least tell your brain the truth. Always tell the truth, at least to yourself. And again, to start noting the history of where you are, church, organization, you name it. Be a keeper of truth.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the opportunity. I have two things. One's something to say and one's a question. Earlier you said, I wrote it down, but I'm going to try to do it by memory, that you do not believe that education changes hearts, but that a changed heart will seek education. And I agree with 98% of that.
You don't have to agree with any of it.
I do.
But thank you for 98%.
Yeah. However, I have found a place, a group, that I have been doing this work, and I have seen for those whose hearts need changing simply because they don't know that it exists yet. I have found that education delivered in a community of grace-filled, loving, multiracial community can change the heart enough to crave and want more education. Just a bit of hopefulness. My question, however, is part of my learning and my work has helped me to see that white supremacy harms every one of us, and that the trauma, I'm going to lean on what I've learned in the work to feel confident to say this, but that the trauma is also experienced by white people.
Oh, that's for sure.
Right? Particularly children. seeing it. And I grew up part of my childhood next to a sundown town. And I remember that billboard. Or I remember hearing about it. I don't know if I saw it or I have a memory, but I want to know if you know.
I want to pause you. For those in the room who don't know what that is, you want to tell them?
There are towns where it was known that black people should not be in the town after sundown or they would be harmed or killed. And they were often that was communicated on billboards.
All over the country, not
all
just
over
the
the
South.
country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, here in
And
Northwest Arkansas.
so coming here, I didn't actually realize you had a focus on trauma-informed therapy, but my question is, are there places where there are interracial kind of doing business with that trauma? Because sometimes I don't want to say, hey, I've got trauma because my trauma is the very little t compared to the systemic trauma of racism in this country. But my heart craves a place where we can work on those things together. And I wonder if you know practices or people who are doing that.
So off the top of my head, I cannot think of a practitioner specifically working with white Americans who've experienced racialized trauma, vicarious trauma, or the trauma of whiteness. I will say that the person who I know who has written about it, that topic the most, is Mark Charles. Do you know who Mark Charles is? Okay, Mark Charles is a biracial man, Navajo and white, and he specifically writes about how trauma impacts white people in our racialized society. So Mark Charles comes to mind. He's got a book about the doctrine of discovery. There might be ringing some bells in here, baby. And I'll do some digging around that. And I will let Lowell know if I can think of somebody. Yeah, sure.
I also want to mention the book "Dying of Whiteness." Yeah, that was recently published. Yeah, all the ways in which white supremacy harm white people. I'm struggling. I think it's a professor at Vanderbilt who wrote that book. So
I would really like universal health care, y'all. I really would like it. I mean, and you know why we don't have it, right? Right. You have a sense of why other nations of European descent who have the economic means have universal health care and why we don't? I would propose this racialization. It's because the undeserving would get it too. And because of racism, there are white people who are like, I am willing not to have this if she gets it, right? So, and so that dying of whiteness has this irrational element to it where people will end up voting in or supporting things that actually cause them deep harm so that my children don't get it.
Cutting off their nose to spite their faces.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah. On that positive note.
My name is Lowell Taylor. I'm a co-host of the R Word podcast and board member of the Zacchaeus Foundation. And in our last few minutes, I want to do three things. The first is say thank you, and I want you all to join me in saying thank you to Doctors Edmondson, Banton, and Posey. Well-deserved standing ovation. So thank you all for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm so personally thankful for your presence in my life as friends and teachers, and for sharing your wisdom with us today. I also want to thank Fayetteville Public Library, specifically our friend Joel Bunch, who introduced us today. This is not our first event working with the library. They've been wonderful partners, as have our friends at KUAF across the street. So thank you to them. I also want to say thank you to some folks who helped pay for today. That includes the Methodist Foundation for Arkansas, St. Paul's Episcopal Church. It includes Christ the King Anglican Church and Grace Church of Northwest Arkansas. So thank you to the folks who helped pay for today. Lastly, I want to thank you all for being here. This is, as I mentioned, not our first event, but it is our best attended at about 60 folks. It won't be our last event, so I hope that you continue to come. Two other things I want to do briefly are to introduce the Zacchaeus Foundation and invite you all to work with us. So I'll do that very briefly. But the Zacchaeus Foundation is a nonprofit working for racial healing in Northwest Arkansas. We are working to repair truth, wealth, and power. Truth by educating white people like me about reparations. Wealth by investing in black-led nonprofits here in Northwest Arkansas. And power by empowering black people to decide who receives the money. So that's a very brief introduction to the Zacchaeus Foundation. An invitation to work with us. I'm thankful that we have black, white, and perhaps other identifying people in the room, but for just a brief minute, I want to speak to the white folks and suggest that there may be two kinds of white people in the room today. Those asking whether we should practice reparations, and those asking how we could. Whether we should, how we could. So two invitations to those asking whether we should, who are perhaps unsure. I invite you to educate yourselves. There's a number of ways to do that, but two are to listen to the podcast. Dr. Edmondson has been on the podcast previously, as have many other people smarter than me. So I invite you to listen to the podcast and to attend future events that will be here at the library and other places. Information about those events is on the handout with QR codes aplenty, okay? But what about the second group of white people, perhaps those who would say, you know what, I think that we should practice reparations, but are asking, well, how could we do that? I want to propose that we can here now. And I want to invite you to invest in the Zacchaeus Fund for Black-led nonprofits. Now, you received what looks like a condiment container, about 50 of you, with a dime and a penny in it. So, like, why were you given 11 cents? The black-white wealth gap means the average black household has 10% of the wealth of the average white household. A dime to every dollar. The black-white wealth gap was opened by theft. So those of us who are white have the opportunity to close it by returning what we have stolen. So the invitation to you all, individually, institutionally, white people, white churches, is to invest 1% of your annual income, your annual tithes in the Zacchaeus Fund, a penny to your dollar. That's an invitation that I extend to you, having decided to do that personally. So that's what my family's doing, and I invite you to join us. So I think, you know, one of your questions was, what can we do? There's more than one thing to do. This is not the way to be faithfully anti-racist or to practice reparations, but it is a way. So I wanted to conclude with those last words. With that, we do have time. Dr. Edmondson will be in the back signing copies of her book, Faithful Anti-Racism, if you care to stay for that. And then there's some other information in terms of where we go from here on your handout. So that's all. Thank you. Yeah, Alan.
No, I was just going to ask if you could just give a brief explanation of what the Zacchaeus Foundation is.
Alan asked, this will be on the podcast later, for a brief explanation of what the Zacchaeus Foundation is. So I'm going to defer, and I'm going to say two things. You can read about it on our website. On the Learn More, on the back of your handout, there's a link. It says the Zacchaeus Foundation. That's a link to a paper outlining what the Zacchaeus Foundation is. We've also presented that paper on the podcast previously at the University of Arkansas in Dr. Banton's African and African American Studies class. So that information is available. It's an excellent question, Alan, but don't want to take the time to answer it in full today. I'm also personally available to have that longer conversation with just about anybody, anywhere, anytime. All right. Thank y'all.